Tommy and Billy Henderson disappeared on July 15, 1971, while visiting Disneyland with their parents during what was supposed to be the most magical day of their young lives. The 8-year-old identical twins had been exploring Fantasyland when they vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would haunt their family for nearly 2 decades. But to understand the magnitude of this loss, we must first journey back to the beginning of their story, to the warm summer days that led up to that fateful visit to the Magic Kingdom. The Henderson family lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street in Garden Grove, just 15 miles from the gates of Disneyland. Robert Henderson, 32, worked as a mechanic at a local Ford dealership, his hands permanently stained with motor oil, and his work shirts bearing the faint scent of gasoline that had become as familiar to his family as his evening cologne. His wife, Margaret, 29, spent her days caring for the twins and working part-time at the neighborhood grocery store, where she knew every customer by name and could recite their usual purchases from memory. They were the embodiment of the American middle class in 1971, hard-working people who believed deeply in the promise that dedication and perseverance would provide their children with opportunities they themselves had never enjoyed. Tommy and Billy were mirror images of each other in appearance but couldn't have been more different in personality. Tommy, older by 12 minutes, possessed an adventurous spirit that often led him to climb the highest trees in their backyard and explore every corner of their neighborhood, with the fearless curiosity of a natural explorer. His dark hair was perpetually tousled, and his knees bore the permanent badges of his adventures in the form of small scars and fresh scrapes. Billy, meanwhile, was the thoughtful observer, content to sit on the front porch with a book or help their mother in the kitchen, carefully measuring ingredients and asking endless questions about how things worked. Where Tommy saw obstacles to overcome, Billy saw puzzles to solve. Where Tommy rushed headfirst into new experiences, Billy preferred to watch and learn before taking his first careful step. The summer of 1971 had been particularly challenging for the Henderson family. Robert had been working overtime shifts at the dealership, trying to save enough money for a vacation that seemed perpetually just out of reach. Margaret had picked up extra hours at the grocery store, often working until late evening while the boys stayed with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, who would regale them with stories of her childhood in Poland while teaching them to play chess on her kitchen table. The twins had spent most of their summer days in their backyard, constructing elaborate fortresses out of cardboard boxes that Robert brought home from work, or riding their bicycles up and down Maple Street until the street lights flickered on, and Margaret called them in for dinner. It was during one particularly warm evening in early July that Robert made the announcement that would change everything. He had been saving money in an old coffee tin hidden behind their wedding photo on the living room mantelpiece, dropping in spare change and occasional dollar bills whenever he could manage it. That evening, as the family sat around their small dining table sharing a meal of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, Robert cleared his throat and pulled out the coffee tin with the ceremonial gravity of a magician revealing his greatest trick. Inside was enough money for a day at Disneyland, including admission tickets, parking, and even enough for lunch at one of the park's restaurants. The twins' reaction was immediate and explosive. Tommy leaped from his chair and began racing around the living room, whooping with joy and performing impromptu somersaults on the carpet. Billy sat perfectly still for a moment, his eyes wide with disbelief, before quietly asking if this meant they would really, truly get to see Mickey Mouse in person. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched her husband's proud smile, knowing how many overtime shifts and sacrificed lunches had gone into filling that coffee tin. This wasn't just a family vacation, it was a declaration of love, a promise that despite their modest means, their children deserved to experience the wonder and magic that other families took for granted. The 2 weeks between Robert's announcement and their planned visit were filled with an electricity that seemed to charge the very air in their small house. The twins pored over the Disneyland brochures that Robert had picked up at a travel agency, studying every ride and attraction with the intensity of military strategists planning a campaign. They created detailed lists of everything they wanted to see and do, debating the merits of various attractions and trying to determine the most efficient route through the park. Tommy was particularly excited about the Matterhorn bobsleds, while Billy dreamed of taking a boat ride through the Pirates of the Caribbean attraction that had opened just a few years earlier. Margaret spent her evenings carefully planning their outfits for the big day, washing and ironing their best clothes, and making sure their shoes were polished to a shine that would make them proud to walk through Walt Disney's magical kingdom. She had purchased a new camera specifically for the occasion, a small Kodak Instamatic that she practiced using by taking countless photos of the twins in their backyard, wanting to ensure she would capture every precious moment of their Disneyland adventure. Robert took time off from work to research the best route to Anaheim, studying road maps and talking to coworkers who had made the journey before. He checked and rechecked their old Chevrolet station wagon, changing the oil and inspecting the tires to make sure their family chariot would deliver them safely to their destination. In the evenings, he would sit with the boys and share stories he had heard about Disneyland, painting vivid pictures of a place where dreams came to life and anything seemed possible. The neighborhood seemed to share in the family's excitement. Mrs. Kowalski spent hours listening to the twins' detailed plans, offering advice about which attractions were suitable for boys their age, and warning them to stay close to their parents in the crowds. Mr. Peterson from next door, who had taken his own children to Disneyland the previous summer, provided insider tips about the best times to visit popular attractions and where to find the shortest lines. Even Mrs. Chen from the grocery store where Margaret worked gave her a small bag of homemade cookies to take on their journey, insisting that every magical adventure needed proper provisions. As July 15th approached, the anticipation became almost unbearable. The twins had difficulty sleeping, their minds racing with visions of castle spires and spinning teacups, of meeting their favorite Disney characters, and experiencing rides they had only seen in television commercials. They practiced their autograph requests in front of the bathroom mirror, carefully pronouncing each character's name and perfecting their most polite greetings. Tommy decided he would ask Mickey Mouse about his adventures, while Billy planned to inquire about the construction techniques used in building the various attractions. The night before their departure, Margaret tucked the twins into their beds and sat between them, reading from a book about Walt Disney and his incredible vision for a place where families could escape the ordinary world and step into realms of pure imagination. The boys listened with rapt attention, their eyes bright with excitement and wonder. Tommy asked if they would really be able to see everything in just one day, while Billy wondered aloud if the Disney characters were as kind in person as they appeared in movies. Margaret assured them that tomorrow would be a day they would remember for the rest of their lives, never knowing how prophetic those words would prove to be. Robert spent that final evening cleaning the station wagon one more time, checking the tire pressure and filling the gas tank. He packed a small cooler with sandwiches and cold drinks for the drive, wanting to save every possible dollar for their actual park experience. As he worked in the garage, he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride, knowing that he had provided his family with something truly special. This wasn't just a day trip to an amusement park. It was proof that hard work and sacrifice could create moments of pure joy for the people you loved most in the world. The morning of July 15th dawned bright and clear, with temperatures that promised a perfect day for outdoor adventures. The Henderson family rose before sunrise, their excitement barely contained as they prepared for their magical journey. Margaret had laid out everyone's clothes the night before, and the twins dressed quickly, their movements animated by anticipation. Robert loaded the station wagon while Margaret packed a diaper bag with snacks, first aid supplies, and the precious camera that would document their wonderful day together. As they backed out of their driveway on Maple Street, Tommy and Billy pressed their faces against the rear window, waving goodbye to their familiar neighborhood and the life they knew. Mrs. Kowalski stood on her front porch in her bathrobe, waving back with tears in her eyes, touched by the sight of this loving family embarking on their grand adventure. The Henderson station wagon disappeared around the corner, carrying 4 happy people toward a destiny that none of them could have imagined, toward a place where magic and wonder awaited, but where something far more sinister lurked beneath the surface of smiling faces and cheerful music. The Henderson family arrived at Disneyland's parking lot at 8:47 a.m. on July 15, 1971, with the California sun already warming the asphalt and the distant sound of the Disneyland Railroad whistle carrying across the morning air like a musical invitation to adventure. Robert maneuvered their station wagon into a parking space in the Goofy section, row 12, carefully writing down the location on a small piece of paper that he tucked into his shirt pocket. The twins practically bounced in their seats as they gathered their belongings, their eyes wide with wonder, as they caught their first glimpse of the Matterhorn's snow-capped peak, rising majestically above the trees in the distance. Margaret checked her purse one final time, ensuring she had their admission tickets, the camera, and enough money for lunch and souvenirs. She had braided her hair into a neat bun and worn her favorite blue dress, the one Robert had complimented her on during their wedding anniversary dinner just 2 months earlier. The boys looked handsome in their matching white polo shirts and dark blue shorts, their hair carefully combed and their sneakers spotlessly clean. Robert locked the car doors and took a moment to survey his family, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction at being able to provide this experience for the people he loved most in the world. The walk from the parking lot to the main entrance felt like a pilgrimage, with families streaming alongside them in the same direction, all united by the same sense of anticipation and excitement. Tommy and Billy held hands with their parents, their heads turning constantly to take in every detail of their surroundings. The landscaping was immaculate, with perfectly manicured flower beds spelling out words in colorful blooms, and uniformed employees directing traffic with genuine smiles and helpful attitudes that seemed almost too good to be true. At the ticket booths, Robert presented their pre-purchased admission tickets to a young woman whose name tag read Jennifer, and whose enthusiastic welcome made it seem as though the Henderson family were the most important guests to ever visit the Magic Kingdom. She handed each family member a colorful map of the park and explained the basic layout, pointing out the locations of restrooms, first aid stations, and guest services. Tommy immediately unfolded his map and began tracing potential routes with his finger, while Billy studied the detailed illustrations of each attraction with the focused attention of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. Passing through the turnstiles felt like crossing a threshold into another world entirely. Main Street, USA stretched before them like something from a Norman Rockwell painting brought to life, with horse-drawn carriages clip-clopping down the center of the street, the aroma of fresh-baked cookies and popcorn wafting from storefront windows, and the cheerful melody of ragtime piano music floating through the air from hidden speakers. Margaret immediately reached for her camera, determined to capture every moment of their magical day, starting with a photograph of the twins standing in front of the train station with their arms around each other's shoulders. The family spent their first hour exploring Main Street, visiting the Penny Arcade where Robert showed the boys how to operate the antique fortune-telling machines, browsing through the candy shop where Margaret purchased a small bag of saltwater taffy as a special treat, and riding the omnibus down to the central hub where Sleeping Beauty Castle rose like something from a fairy tale against the brilliant blue California sky. Every few minutes, one of the twins would tug on their parents' clothing and point excitedly at some new wonder they had discovered, their voices breathless with amazement at the incredible attention to detail that surrounded them. Their first major attraction was the Jungle Cruise, where they waited in line for 25 minutes, while Tommy entertained other guests with his impressions of various animal sounds, and Billy quietly observed the elaborate queue decorations, asking their father detailed questions about the different types of plants and flowers that had been imported to create such an authentic tropical atmosphere. Their boat captain, a jovial man named Chuck, whose rehearsed jokes seemed fresh and spontaneous, guided them through waters populated by mechanical hippos and elephants so realistic that several passengers gasped in genuine surprise when they moved. By mid-morning, the park had filled considerably with visitors, and the pathways that had seemed spacious and open during their arrival now bustled with families, teenagers, and elderly couples, all seeking their own versions of Disney magic. The Henderson family adapted to the crowds with good humor, using the waiting times and attraction lines as opportunities to study their maps, plan their next destinations, and take additional photographs. Margaret had already used half a roll of film, capturing images of the twins on the spinning teacups, waving from their flying Dumbo elephant, and posing with a costumed Chip and Dale character near the entrance to Fantasyland. Robert proved to be an excellent navigator, successfully guiding his family through the increasingly complex maze of pathways and keeping track of their location, even as the park's seemingly logical layout occasionally defied conventional geographic understanding. He had developed a system for managing their day, alternating between high-energy attractions and more relaxed experiences, ensuring that everyone stayed hydrated and comfortable despite the rising temperatures and growing crowds. It was approximately 1:15 p.m. when the Henderson family entered Fantasyland, drawn by Tommy's urgent desire to experience the Matterhorn bobsleds, and Billy's quieter but equally intense interest in taking a boat ride through the It's a Small World attraction. Margaret suggested they have lunch first, but the twins pleaded for just one more ride before eating, their energy levels still remarkably high despite having been at the park for more than 4 hours. Robert checked his watch and calculated that they had time for one quick attraction before finding a restaurant, agreeing to let the boys choose their next adventure. The decision between the Matterhorn and Small World created a brief but intense negotiation between the twins, with Tommy advocating for the excitement of the roller coaster and Billy preferring the gentler boat ride through different cultures and countries. Margaret suggested they compromise by visiting both attractions, starting with Small World, since its line appeared shorter, and then proceeding to the Matterhorn before lunch. This solution satisfied both boys, and the family made their way toward the colorful facade of the It's a Small World building, its whimsical clock tower and international flags creating an atmosphere of global harmony and celebration. The line for It's a Small World moved steadily, and within 15 minutes the Henderson family found themselves seated in a small boat that would carry them through scenes depicting children from around the world, singing the attraction's famous theme song. Margaret sat between the twins, with Robert behind them operating the camera to capture their reactions as they encountered each new tableau of mechanical children, dressed in traditional costumes from different countries. Tommy pointed excitedly at every new scene, asking questions about the various nations represented, while Billy sat quietly, seemingly mesmerized by the repetitive melody and the synchronized movements of the figures. When their boat emerged from the attraction at 2:03 p.m., the twins were energized and eager to continue their adventure. Robert suggested they find a restroom and get some lunch, but Tommy immediately began pulling his family toward the Matterhorn, insisting that they couldn't leave Fantasyland without experiencing what he considered the ultimate Disney thrill ride. Billy seemed less enthusiastic about the roller coaster, but was willing to go along with his brother's wishes, as had become their customary dynamic throughout their young lives. The area around the Matterhorn was particularly crowded, with multiple attraction lines converging near the base of the artificial mountain. Robert held Margaret's hand while she kept a firm grip on Billy's small fingers, but Tommy had darted slightly ahead, his excitement overriding his usual obedience to stay close to his parents. The noise level was considerable, with the sounds of the bobsleds racing through the mountain's tunnels, the splash of the nearby submarine voyage, and the constant chatter of hundreds of visitors all combining to create an almost overwhelming sensory experience. Margaret called out to Tommy to wait for the rest of the family, but her voice was lost in the ambient noise of the crowded area. She could see her son just a few feet ahead, standing on his tiptoes to get a better view of the Matterhorn's entrance, his white polo shirt clearly visible among the sea of other visitors. Robert was studying the map, trying to determine the most efficient route to the attraction's queue, while Billy remained close to his mother's side, apparently overwhelmed by the intensity of the crowds and noise surrounding them. It was at this moment, at approximately 2:07 p.m. on July 15, 1971, that everything changed for the Henderson family. Margaret looked away from Tommy for no more than 30 seconds to help Billy tie his shoelace, which had come undone during their walk from the Small World attraction. When she looked up again, scanning the crowd for her son's familiar white shirt and tousled dark hair, Tommy was nowhere to be seen. The spot where he had been standing just moments before was now occupied by other visitors, and despite her increasingly frantic visual search of the immediate area, she could not locate her 8-year-old son. Margaret's first reaction was not panic, but confusion, followed by the assumption that Tommy had simply moved to a different vantage point or had been momentarily obscured by taller visitors. She called his name several times, her voice initially calm but growing more urgent with each repetition. Robert looked up from his map study, immediately recognizing the tone in his wife's voice that indicated something was wrong. Billy sensed the change in atmosphere and pressed closer to his mother's side, his young mind not yet comprehending the situation, but instinctively recognizing that their magical day had somehow shifted into something different and frightening. For the next 10 minutes, The Henderson family conducted an increasingly desperate search of the immediate area around the Matterhorn, calling Tommy's name and asking other visitors if they had seen a boy matching his description. Robert approached several Disney employees, providing detailed information about his son's appearance and last known location, while Margaret refused to move more than a few feet from the spot where she had last seen Tommy, convinced that he would return to find them there. The transformation from a day of joy and wonder to one of terror and desperation happened with shocking speed. By 2:20 p.m., Robert had located a security supervisor who immediately radioed for additional assistance and began coordinating a more systematic search effort. Margaret remained frozen near the Matterhorn entrance, clutching Billy's hand so tightly that he began to complain about the discomfort, her eyes scanning every face in the crowd with the desperate intensity of someone whose world had suddenly collapsed around her. Disney's response was swift and professional, but it also revealed the company's well-rehearsed procedures for dealing with missing children, suggesting that such incidents were not entirely uncommon. Within minutes, several security personnel had arrived at the scene, and a discreet but thorough search of the immediate area was underway. The employees maintained calm, reassuring demeanors, while efficiently coordinating their efforts, occasionally speaking into handheld radios using codes and terminology that the Henderson family couldn't understand, but that clearly indicated the seriousness of the situation. By 3 p.m., when Tommy had been missing for nearly an hour, the scope of the search had expanded significantly. Disney security had contacted the Anaheim Police Department, and plainclothes officers had begun arriving at the park to assist in the investigation. The Henderson family was escorted to a private office behind Main Street, where they provided detailed statements about their day's activities, Tommy's personality, and typical behavior patterns, and any interactions they might have had with strangers or unusual situations. The questions posed by investigators were thorough and sometimes difficult for the family to answer. Had Tommy ever run away before? Did he have any medical conditions or special needs that might affect his judgment? Had anyone approached the family or shown unusual interest in the children during their visit? Robert and Margaret answered as best they could, their voices strained with worry, and their hands trembling as the reality of their situation began to fully sink in. Billy remained largely silent throughout the initial interviews, sitting close to his mother, and occasionally asking when Tommy would be coming back. The investigators were gentle with him, understanding that his twin brother's disappearance was traumatic enough without subjecting him to intensive questioning. However, they did ask him simple questions about what he had seen and whether Tommy had mentioned wanting to go anywhere specific or had talked to any strangers during their day at the park. As evening approached and Tommy remained missing, the search efforts intensified dramatically. The entire park was systematically combed by teams of security personnel and police officers, with particular attention paid to areas where a small child might hide or become trapped. Maintenance crews were called in to check storage areas, utility spaces, and other behind-the-scenes locations that were normally off-limits to visitors. Every attraction was thoroughly inspected, every restaurant and shop was searched, and every employee who had worked in Fantasyland that day was interviewed about their observations and interactions with guests. The media attention began almost immediately, with local television news crews arriving at the park's entrance as word of the missing child spread through official channels. Disney's public relations team worked to manage the situation, providing carefully worded statements that expressed concern for the missing boy, while emphasizing the company's cooperation with law enforcement and their commitment to guest safety. The delicate balance between transparency and protecting the company's reputation was evident in every official communication about the case. Margaret refused to leave the park that night, convinced that Tommy might still be somewhere within its boundaries, possibly injured or frightened but alive and waiting for rescue. Robert eventually persuaded her to return to their hotel room, but neither parent slept during the long night of July 15th into July 16th, 1971. They sat by the phone, waiting for news that never came, holding Billy between them on the hotel bed while he asked questions they couldn't answer about when his brother would come home. The search for Tommy Henderson would continue for weeks, then months, involving hundreds of law enforcement personnel, volunteers from the community, and Disney employees who gave up their off-duty time to help look for the missing boy. Despite the extensive efforts, No trace of Tommy was ever found within Disneyland or in the surrounding areas. He had simply vanished, as completely and mysteriously as if he had never existed at all, leaving behind only questions, heartbreak, and a family whose lives would never be the same. The weeks following Tommy Henderson's disappearance transformed the family's modest Garden Grove home into a nerve center of desperate hope and crushing disappointment. Margaret had converted their small dining room into a makeshift command post, covering the walls with maps of Southern California, photographs of Tommy, and detailed timelines of their final day together. She maintained meticulous records of every phone call from law enforcement, every potential sighting reported by well-meaning strangers, and every lead that investigators pursued through the labyrinthine possibilities of what might have happened to her son. Robert returned to work at the Ford dealership 3 weeks after Tommy vanished, not because he felt ready to resume normal life, but because their savings had been depleted by hotel stays, restaurant meals, and the countless expenses associated with maintaining a presence near the ongoing search efforts. His co-workers treated him with awkward kindness, offering condolences and assistance, while struggling to find appropriate words for a tragedy that defied their understanding. The familiar rhythm of repairing engines and changing oil provided a temporary escape from the constant anxiety that had become his new normal, but even the most routine tasks were interrupted by moments when he would stop working entirely, staring into space as he wondered what had happened to his son. Billy's reaction to his twin brother's absence was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the family's ordeal. The 8-year-old struggled to comprehend why Tommy had simply vanished, asking questions that revealed both his innocence and his profound confusion about the situation. He would set out 2 bowls for breakfast each morning, carefully preparing Tommy's favorite cereal and waiting patiently for his brother to appear. At night, he refused to sleep in their shared bedroom alone, instead curling up on a makeshift bed in his parents' room, where he felt safer but still called out for Tommy in his sleep. The initial police investigation was thorough and professional, led by Detective Raymond Walsh, a 20-year veteran of the Anaheim Police Department who had handled numerous missing person cases, but had never encountered anything quite like Tommy's disappearance. Walsh interviewed dozens of Disneyland employees, reviewed security protocols, and examined every piece of physical evidence from the park that might provide clues about what had happened. The investigation revealed that Disneyland's security measures, while extensive for 1971, had significant gaps that could potentially be exploited by someone with knowledge of the park's operations. Detective Walsh's reports, which Robert and Margaret were allowed to review periodically, painted a picture of a complex investigation hampered by the sheer volume of people who had been in the park that day and the limited surveillance technology available at the time. Unlike modern theme parks with comprehensive video monitoring systems, Disneyland in 1971 relied primarily on human observation and periodic security patrols to maintain order and safety. The few security cameras that did exist were primarily focused on cash handling areas and employee entrances, leaving vast sections of the park essentially unmonitored. The investigation uncovered several troubling incidents from Disneyland's past that had never received public attention. Walsh's team discovered reports of previous occasions when children had gone missing for brief periods, usually found within hours in attractions where they had become separated from their families or had wandered into restricted areas. However, Tommy's case was different in its completeness and permanence. Unlike the other incidents, there were no witnesses who remembered seeing him after his mother had looked away to help Billy with his shoelace, no security footage that captured his movements, and no physical evidence that suggested where he might have gone. Margaret became obsessed with studying every detail of their final day at Disneyland, creating detailed diagrams of their movements through the park and interviewing other families who had been there on July 15th. She placed advertisements in local newspapers, asking anyone who had been at the park that day to contact her if they had any memories or photographs that might include Tommy. The response was overwhelming, with hundreds of people calling to offer their assistance, share their own experiences, or simply express their sympathy for the family's loss. Some of the most promising leads came from other visitors who had taken photographs at Disneyland on July 15th and were willing to share their film with the Henderson family. Margaret spent countless hours examining these images with a magnifying glass, searching for any glimpse of Tommy in the background of strangers' vacation pictures. Occasionally, she would find a photograph that seemed to show a boy who might have been her son, but the images were always too distant or unclear to provide definitive identification. The FBI became involved in the case during the second month of the investigation, bringing additional resources and expertise to the search effort. Special Agent Patricia Morrison, who specialized in cases involving missing children, worked closely with local law enforcement to expand the scope of the investigation beyond Southern California. Morrison's team examined the possibility that Tommy might have been taken across state lines, interviewed known individuals with histories of crimes involving children, and coordinated with law enforcement agencies throughout the western United States. Agent Morrison's approach was methodical and comprehensive, but it also introduced new and terrifying possibilities that the Henderson family had not previously considered. The investigation revealed that 1971 was a time of significant social upheaval, with numerous groups and individuals operating outside traditional social structures. The hippie movement, various religious cults, and other alternative communities had created networks of people who lived largely off the official radar, making it theoretically possible for a child to disappear into these subcultures without leaving conventional traces. Disney's corporate response to the investigation was complex and sometimes contradictory. Publicly, company representatives expressed full cooperation with law enforcement and emphasized their commitment to guest safety. However, the family's attorney, whom they had retained during the third month of Tommy's disappearance, discovered that Disney had been less than completely forthcoming about certain aspects of their security procedures and employee background check processes. The company's primary concern seemed to be protecting their reputation and minimizing negative publicity, rather than ensuring that every possible avenue of investigation was thoroughly explored. The attorney, James Hendricks, was a seasoned professional who specialized in cases involving corporate negligence and had experience dealing with large companies that prioritized their public image over individual concerns. Hendricks discovered that Disney maintained extensive records of employee activities and guest interactions, but gaining access to these documents required persistent legal pressure and carefully worded subpoenas. The company's legal team was skilled at providing the minimum amount of information required by law, while withholding details that might prove embarrassing or legally problematic. As the investigation progressed through the fall and winter of 1971, the emotional toll on the Henderson family became increasingly evident. Margaret lost 30 pounds and developed chronic insomnia, often staying awake until dawn, studying photographs and maps while chain-smoking cigarettes that she had never touched before Tommy's disappearance. Robert began drinking more heavily, not to the point of obvious intoxication, but enough to dull the sharp edges of his constant worry and guilt about his failure to protect his son. Billy struggled academically during his third-grade year, unable to concentrate on schoolwork, while dealing with the absence of his twin brother and the obvious distress of his parents. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was understanding and patient, but she also recommended that the family consider counseling to help Billy process his trauma and adjust to his new reality as an only child. The suggestion was well-intentioned, but it highlighted how completely Tommy's disappearance had altered every aspect of their family dynamics. The first anniversary of Tommy's disappearance passed quietly, marked by a small memorial service at their local church, and renewed pleas for information through local media outlets. Detective Walsh, who had become genuinely invested in solving the case, organized a comprehensive review of all evidence and witness statements, hoping that fresh eyes might identify previously overlooked clues. The review process was exhaustive, but ultimately fruitless, confirming what everyone already suspected. Tommy Henderson had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Throughout 1972 and 1973, the case remained active, but gradually received less attention from both law enforcement and media outlets. New cases demanded resources and public interest, while Tommy's disappearance became another unsolved mystery in the files of the Anaheim Police Department. Margaret continued her private investigation, corresponding with other families whose children had disappeared under similar circumstances, and maintaining detailed records of every development in the case. The toll of these efforts on her marriage became increasingly apparent as Robert struggled to balance his wife's obsession with finding Tommy against his own need to move forward and rebuild their shattered family life. He loved Margaret deeply and understood her inability to let go of their son, but he also recognized that Billy needed parents who could focus on his present needs rather than remaining perpetually trapped in the past. The tension between these competing demands created strain that threatened to destroy what remained of their family unit. Detective Walsh retired from the Anaheim Police Department in 1976, but he maintained unofficial contact with the Henderson family and continued to follow up on occasional leads that came to his attention. His replacement, Detective Maria Santos, was competent and professional, but she lacked Walsh's personal investment in the case and treated it as one of many unsolved mysteries requiring periodic attention rather than active investigation. By the late 1970s, the Henderson family had achieved a fragile equilibrium that allowed them to function despite their ongoing grief and unanswered questions. Margaret had returned to work at the grocery store, finding that interactions with customers provided a welcome distraction from her private torment. Robert had been promoted to shop foreman at the dealership, partly in recognition of his technical skills, but also because his co-workers and supervisors wanted to help him rebuild his life after the tragedy that had befallen his family. Billy grew into adolescence carrying the weight of his brother's disappearance and his parents' unresolved grief. He was a serious, thoughtful teenager who excelled academically but struggled with social relationships, finding it difficult to explain his family's history to classmates and friends. The absence of his twin brother had fundamentally shaped his identity and worldview, making him both more independent and more cautious than other young people his age. The early 1980s brought new investigative techniques and technologies that offered hope for solving cold cases like Tommy's disappearance. Detective Santos reopened the file several times, applying new forensic methods to existing evidence and exploring leads that had been impossible to pursue with earlier technology. However, these efforts were hampered by the fact that much of the original evidence had deteriorated over time, and many of the witnesses had moved away or died in the intervening years. Margaret's health began to decline in the mid-1980s, the cumulative stress of 15 years of uncertainty taking its toll on both her physical and mental well-being. She developed heart problems that her doctor attributed partly to chronic stress and anxiety, and she was hospitalized several times for episodes that seemed to be triggered by particularly intense periods of worry about Tommy's fate. Robert became her primary caregiver while continuing to work full-time, a responsibility that added additional strain to his already difficult life. The case file for Tommy Henderson's disappearance had grown to include hundreds of pages of reports, witness statements, photographs, and correspondence by the time Detective Santos passed it along to her successor in 1988. The new detective, Lieutenant David Chen, was young and energetic, with experience in cold case investigations and access to computer databases that previous investigators had not possessed. Chen approached the case with fresh enthusiasm, but he also had realistic expectations about the likelihood of solving a mystery that had stumped experienced investigators for nearly 2 decades. Chen's review of the case files revealed patterns and connections that earlier investigators had missed, partly because the technology to cross-reference information across different jurisdictions had not existed when the investigation began. He discovered that several other children had disappeared from various California amusement parks during the 1970s, though none under circumstances exactly like Tommy's case. The similarities were intriguing, but not conclusive, suggesting either coincidence or the possibility of a more complex pattern that investigators had not previously recognized. As 1989 progressed and the 20th anniversary of Tommy's disappearance approached, the Henderson family had settled into patterns of life that accommodated their permanent loss while allowing them to function as a family unit. Billy had graduated from high school and was attending community college, studying engineering with the same methodical approach that had characterized his personality since childhood. Margaret's health had stabilized somewhat, and she had found purpose in volunteering with support groups for families of missing children. Robert had become something of a mentor figure at the dealership, using his experience with tragedy to help younger employees deal with their own personal crises. None of them could have imagined that their long nightmare was about to take a dramatic turn. or that answers to questions they had carried for nearly 2 decades were hidden just below their feet, waiting in the dark spaces beneath the Magic Kingdom, where dreams and nightmares intersected in ways that Walt Disney had never intended. The discovery that would finally shed light on Tommy Henderson's fate was still months away, but the wheels of revelation had already been set in motion by routine maintenance work that would soon expose secrets that had been buried for far too long. The discovery that would forever change the Henderson family's understanding of their son's fate began with a routine maintenance issue on February 14, 1990, when Disneyland's facilities management team received reports of persistent water pressure problems affecting several attractions in Fantasyland. What had initially seemed like a simple plumbing repair would soon expose secrets that had remained hidden beneath the Magic Kingdom for nearly 19 years, bringing both answers and new questions to a case that had haunted investigators and the Henderson family for almost 2 decades. Lead maintenance supervisor Frank Rodriguez had been working at Disneyland for 12 years and had seen his share of unusual situations, from power outages that stranded guests on attractions to unexpected wildlife encounters in the park's landscaped areas. However, nothing in his experience had prepared him for what his team would uncover in the underground utility tunnels that ran beneath Fantasyland's most popular attractions. The water pressure issues had been traced to a section of aging pipe infrastructure that had been installed during the park's original construction in the 1950s, requiring excavation and replacement of several hundred feet of main supply lines. The work began on a Monday morning with a crew of 6 experienced maintenance workers using heavy machinery to carefully excavate around the buried pipes without damaging other underground utilities or disturbing the attractions operating above them. The tunnels beneath Disneyland were a complex network of service corridors, storage areas, and utility spaces that allowed the park to function seamlessly while maintaining the illusion of magic for guests walking on the surface. Most visitors never realized that an entire hidden world existed just below their feet, where costumed characters could move between attractions without being seen, and where thousands of technical systems operated continuously to maintain the park's operations. Rodriguez and his team had been working for 3 days, methodically exposing and examining the deteriorated pipe sections, when crew member Tony Martinez made the discovery that would change everything. While using a flashlight to inspect a particularly corroded joint approximately 15 feet below ground level, Martinez noticed what appeared to be fabric protruding from a section of pipe that had split open sometime in the distant past. At first, he assumed it was construction debris that had been inadvertently buried during earlier maintenance work, but closer examination revealed that the material appeared to be clothing rather than industrial materials. The work stopped immediately as Rodriguez assessed the situation and realized that they might have stumbled upon something far more significant than routine maintenance issues. He ordered his crew to step back from the excavation site and contacted his supervisor, who in turn notified Park Security and Anaheim Police Department. Within 2 hours, Detective Lieutenant David Chen arrived at the scene, accompanied by forensic specialists and crime scene technicians who would spend the next several days carefully documenting and recovering what had been hidden in the underground darkness for nearly 2 decades. The recovery process was painstaking and methodical, requiring the complete excavation of a 30-foot section of tunnel while preserving every piece of potential evidence. What the investigators found confirmed their worst fears and provided the answers that the Henderson family had been seeking since July 15, 1971. The remains were those of a young child, along with personal items that included a distinctive wristwatch that Robert Henderson immediately recognized as the one he had given Tommy for his 8th birthday, just 3 months before their fatal trip to Disneyland. The forensic examination, conducted by Dr. Sarah Morrison of the Orange County Coroner's Office, confirmed that the remains were consistent with those of an 8-year-old boy who had been deceased for approximately 18 to 20 years. While the condition of the remains made definitive identification challenging, the presence of Tommy's watch, along with fragments of clothing that matched Margaret's detailed descriptions of what her son had been wearing on the day he disappeared, provided compelling evidence that the mystery of Tommy Henderson's fate had finally been solved. The location of the discovery raised disturbing questions about how Tommy had ended up in the underground utility tunnels, and whether his death had been accidental or the result of more sinister circumstances. The pipe section where his remains were found was not accessible to park guests through normal means, requiring either specialized knowledge of the park's infrastructure or assistance from someone with authorized access to restricted areas. Detective Chen's investigation team began the complex process of determining how an 8-year-old boy could have ended up in such an inaccessible location and whether his presence there was the result of foul play. The news of the discovery reached the Henderson family through a phone call from Detective Chen on the evening of February 17, 1990. Margaret answered the phone in their kitchen, where she had been preparing dinner while Robert helped Billy with his college coursework at the dining room table. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but its impact on the family was immediate and devastating. After 19 years of hoping against hope that Tommy might still be alive somewhere, they finally had confirmation that their son was gone forever, but they also had new questions about the circumstances of his death that would prove even more troubling than their previous uncertainty. Robert's reaction to the news was complex and contradictory, combining relief at finally having answers with anger at the length of time it had taken to discover the truth. He had spent nearly 2 decades wondering whether his son was alive somewhere, possibly suffering or in need of rescue, and the confirmation that Tommy had been dead since 1971 brought an end to that particular torment while introducing new forms of anguish. The fact that his son's remains had been so close to the place where they had searched desperately for weeks in 1971 felt like a cruel irony that highlighted the inadequacy of the original investigation. Margaret's response was more subdued, but equally profound, as though some part of her had always known that Tommy was gone forever, despite her outward expressions of hope over the intervening years. She sat quietly at the kitchen table for several hours after receiving the news, occasionally touching the photograph of Tommy that she had carried in her wallet every day since his disappearance. The confirmation of his death brought a strange sense of peace alongside her renewed grief, finally allowing her to mourn her son properly after nearly 2 decades of suspended animation between hope and despair. Billy, now 27 years old and working as a junior engineer at an aerospace company, struggled to process the news about his twin brother's fate. He had built his adult identity around the absence of his brother and the uncertainty surrounding Tommy's disappearance, developing coping mechanisms and worldviews that were suddenly challenged by the discovery of definitive answers. The knowledge that Tommy had been dead since they were 8 years old forced Billy to reconsider his entire understanding of his childhood and family history, raising questions about how different his life might have been if they had known the truth from the beginning. The media attention surrounding the discovery was intense but respectful, with local and national news outlets treating the story as both a resolution to a long-standing mystery and a tragedy that had affected an entire community. The Henderson family chose to speak publicly about their experiences, hoping that their story might help other families dealing with similar situations, while also expressing their gratitude to the investigators who had never given up on finding answers. Margaret appeared on several television programs, sharing her memories of Tommy and describing the long journey that had finally led to this bittersweet resolution. Disney's response to the discovery was carefully crafted by corporate communications specialists who understood the delicate nature of the situation and the potential impact on the company's reputation. Official statements expressed sympathy for the Henderson family and emphasized the company's full cooperation with the ongoing investigation, while also noting that the incident had occurred nearly 20 years earlier, under different management and safety protocols. The company's legal team worked behind the scenes to minimize potential liability, while ensuring that all relevant information was shared with investigators. Detective Chen's investigation into the circumstances surrounding Tommy's death revealed significant gaps in Disneyland's security procedures and employee oversight systems as they had existed in 1971. The background check processes for employees had been minimal by modern standards, and access to restricted areas had been less carefully controlled than in later years. While the investigation could not definitively determine whether Tommy's death had been accidental or intentional, the evidence suggested that he had somehow gained access to areas of the park that should have been off-limits to guests, possibly with assistance from someone familiar with the facility's layout. The forensic evidence was inconclusive regarding the exact cause of Tommy's death, partly due to the deteriorated condition of the remains and partly because of the length of time that had elapsed since 1971. Dr. Morrison's examination could not determine whether the boy had suffered any injuries before his death, or whether he had simply become lost in the underground tunnels and been unable to find his way back to safety. The location of the remains suggested that Tommy had been in the utility areas for some time before his death, but the specific circumstances remained a matter of speculation rather than scientific certainty. The investigation also revealed that several other incidents involving missing children at various amusement parks during the 1970s shared certain similarities with Tommy's case, though none had resulted in the discovery of remains or definitive answers about what had happened. Detective Chen worked with law enforcement agencies in other states to determine whether these cases might be connected, but the evidence was too limited, and the time elapsed too great to establish clear links between the incidents. Robert Henderson filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Disney in June 1990, not primarily for financial compensation, but to ensure that the company took responsibility for the security failures that had contributed to his son's death. The legal proceedings dragged on for more than 3 years, ultimately resulting in a confidential settlement that included provisions for improved safety protocols and employee background checks. The exact terms of the settlement were never disclosed, but it was understood to include a substantial financial component, along with Disney's agreement to implement new security measures designed to prevent similar tragedies. The Henderson family used a portion of the settlement money to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting families of missing children and funding research into improved safety protocols at public venues. Margaret became the foundation's primary spokesperson, traveling around the country to speak at conferences and training seminars for law enforcement personnel and security professionals. Her advocacy work provided her with a sense of purpose and meaning that helped her cope with the grief that had defined so much of her adult life. Billy chose to maintain a lower profile, but remained actively involved in the foundation's work, using his engineering background to develop new technologies and procedures that could help prevent children from becoming separated from their families in crowded public spaces. His work included consulting with theme parks, shopping centers, and other venues to identify potential security vulnerabilities and design systems that would make it more difficult for children to access dangerous or restricted areas. The discovery of Tommy's remains brought closure to one of Southern California's most enduring missing person cases, but it also raised new questions about corporate responsibility, safety protocols, and the measures necessary to protect children in public spaces. The case became a touchstone for discussions about background checks for employees who work around children, access control systems for restricted areas, and the importance of comprehensive emergency response procedures when children go missing. Detective Chen retired from the Anaheim Police Department in 2003, but he maintained contact with the Henderson family and continued to follow developments in cases involving missing children. In interviews years later, he described the Tommy Henderson case as both the most challenging and most rewarding investigation of his career, noting that while the resolution came far too late to save the boy's life, it had led to improvements in safety procedures that had potentially prevented other tragedies. Margaret Henderson passed away in 2008 at the age of 66, having spent the final 18 years of her life working to honor her son's memory through advocacy and education. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her work, including law enforcement personnel, other families of missing children, and Disney employees who had worked to implement the safety improvements that resulted from Tommy's case. Robert and Billy spoke at the service about her dedication to ensuring that other families would not have to endure the uncertainty and anguish that had defined their lives for so many years. Today, more than 30 years after Tommy Henderson's remains were discovered in the underground tunnels beneath Disneyland, his case continues to serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance in protecting children and the need for comprehensive safety measures in places where families gather to create happy memories. The foundation established in his name continues its work, and the safety protocols developed as a result of his case have been adopted by venues around the world, creating a lasting legacy that honors the memory of a boy whose life was cut tragically short, but whose death ultimately led to measures that have protected countless other children.